Good afternoon, everyone, or good evening or good morning, depending on where you're logging in from. Welcome to the first of This is Cool webinar series. My name is Finn, and I'm a Rome-based correspondent for the Thomson Reuters Foundation, focusing on food and climate issues. And I'll be your moderator for this session. Now, This is Cool webinar series is about showcasing leadership and solutions. So we're not just talking about the problems, we're also talking about the solutions that would accelerate the transition towards net zero cooling, something that is becoming ever more critical as global temperatures rises and many communities around the world need to stay cool to survive as well as to be able to do their jobs. Now, today's session is going to be focusing on enhancing food security and poverty reduction through net zero food cold chains. And I'd like to invite Brian Dean, who is the lead for energy efficiency and cooling for Sustainable Energy for All, who will be giving welcome remarks. Brian?
Thank you, Finn. And on behalf of the Cooling for All team here at SD for All and the Cool Coalition team at UN Environment, I'm happy to welcome you all to this first This is Cool webinar in collaboration with the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program, Climate and Clean Air Coalition, who really have a great group of partners together for this webinar. And thanks to everyone for joining. So why is it a This is Cool webinar? Well, then got into some bits of it. And what is This is Cool? Well, we started a communications campaign really focusing on solutions, as Finn mentioned. And the first reason for this, well, there's a need. With over 1 billion people who are at high risk due to lack of access to cooling, we see a need for people to understand, well, how can they actually get access to cooling? And ideally, access to sustainable cooling and, as Finn mentioned, this path towards net zero. This is cool. It is very solutions-driven, very visual, simple stories that can really help us all transform our markets and, but also identify business opportunities. With these changing markets, of course, there's an opportunity for business. There's policy opportunities as government policymakers. And of course, there's personal opportunities for each of us to actually be more comfortable, to have safer food, and to make sure that our medicines and healthcare are being effective for us personally. This webinar will discuss one of those key cooling needs, of course, cooling for food. Food and nutrition is one of the 3 key access to cooling needs. I'd invite you to join the conversation and share your solutions with #ThisIsCool. And you can find more about that at thisiscool.seforall.org. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Finn.
Thank you very much, Brian, for that very concise but complete sort of overview of the whole This is Cool. Now, before we get on to our panel discussion, we have an expert who will be briefing us on what are net zero cold chains for food. For that, we have David Etkin, who is the Associate Director of Carbon Trust. David, all yours.
Great, thank you, Finn. Thank you, Brian, and great to be speaking to you all today. So I'll set some brief context before we get on to the panel discussion, as Finn mentioned, and I'll pick out some key highlights from a report that we recently produced. It's available on the Cool Coalition website, the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program website, Carbon Trust website, if you would like more details. And this is really one of these areas where we see big challenge, but also big opportunities to deliver on multiple priorities for stakeholders around the world. And really at the heart of it is delivering affordable, nutritious and safe food that provides good financial returns for producers while minimizing the environmental and climate change impacts from that. And that's challenging. Cold chains play a vital role in helping the food system to deliver against these challenges, but conventional operations are based on refrigerants with high global warming potential and equipment that inefficiently uses energy, and so the environmental impacts can be significant. So what we'll briefly do is step through some of the key points that came up in the report, and then very much on to the experts on the panel to discuss further. So I don't know if we could move on to the next slide, please. I think most folks will be familiar with what a cold chain is, but but just to set that context for those that cold chains are new to, cold chains are really a temperature and humidity controlled system that integrates a series of refrigerated activities from harvesting and production, processing and pre-cooling at the early end, through storage and distribution activities to the end consumer. And when we look at net zero cold chains, it's really about delivering that safe, monitored, integrated refrigerated network with cooling solutions that use environmentally friendly refrigerants that efficiently use low carbon energy to deliver that cold chain in a net zero compatible way. Next slide, please. I think one of the things that really has struck us from the work that we've done on cold chains and comes up in the context of discussions with various folks looking at the sector is very much that the deployment status of cold chains varies significantly around the world, and it's driven by a range of socioeconomic, agri-food sector structure and other factors. And so one of the visuals that we have here is looking at cold storage capacity against GDP per capita. And I think the main thing to take away from this is there's a mix of different levels of cold chain deployment in different countries around the world, and that it's a complex system, both informing and responding to some of these deployment challenges that we see on and deployment opportunities that we see on cold chains. And so while this focuses on cold storage, as we mentioned in the earlier slide, there's various other elements to the cold chain, and so the systems perspective is important when we think about cold chains as a whole. Next slide, please. There's an opportunity and an imperative to both bend the curve on existing greenhouse gas emissions from cold chains. They're about 1% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and developed countries up to about 4% of total greenhouse gas emissions, and really an opportunity to leapfrog in a lot of places to net zero compatible cold chains that avoid locking in some of the conventional approaches that we mentioned earlier. So I won't run through the details here on each of the steps, but you'll see that at each of these areas, there's a significant environmental impact from storing and shifting the food through the chain that through conventional solutions in aggregate delivers some pretty significant environmental impacts that we need to address. Next slide, please. So what's driving this and where's it heading? Well, one thing that came out quite strongly from the literature research we did, the interviews, the surveys that we ran, is that cold chains are at this intersection of a number of mega trends that we see are really going to drive its growth in the coming years. So we see a number of factors from changing dietary preferences, population increases, pressures to understandably reduce food losses in the chain, as well as the impacts that climate change is and will have on food security. Very much intersecting drivers that are projected to significantly increase the deployment of cold chains internationally. And there's an example here from India, drawing on some work from AEEE's analysis in India, looking at the significant increase in emissions that we could see as these intersecting drivers lead to more widespread deployment of cold chains and associated environmental impacts from the conventional solutions to deliver that. And that's across various areas, from cold storage and pack houses through to reefer vehicles or refrigerated transport vehicles and ripening chambers. So across a whole range of areas through that food system. Next slide, please. There's not time to dive into the areas here, but I think the main thing to draw from this is, in deploying cold chains, there's a range of barriers around coordination and planning, logistics and infrastructure, understanding and finance that are a challenge for deploying conventional cold chains. As we look to net zero cold chains, there's some of these barriers that are particularly significant around the awareness of the benefits from shifting to these net zero cold chains, the business cases, the financing models, the capital intensity, the affordability that are significant challenges, which means that on their own, net zero cold chains won't be deployed at scale without support and intervention. And then just to round out on the final slide, the work that we did was really looking at the catalytic role that philanthropy could play in delivering and unlocking cold chains, net zero cold chains for food. And 3 areas jumped out in particular from the research around improving data collection and modeling, the significant data gaps and benefits from improving the models available to people in the sector to understand what's going on. Really important role for advocacy across different areas because it's a system. It's touching on a number of different elements from rural affairs and energy through transport and other dimensions. And an important piece that may get picked up on later, this system dynamics to cold chain, where it's very important to bring the different elements together into integrated demonstrations to show what's possible and how to get there through net zero cold chains for food. And it's not just philanthropy that has a key role to play here. There's a whole range of stakeholders that need to come together to drive the change that we'd all like to see. With that, I'll hand back to Finn to jump on to what I'm sure will be a fascinating panel discussion. Thank you.
Thanks very much, David, for setting the scene, which is, perfectly for the panel discussion, which is going to be looking exactly at what you've just talked about, which is, net zero cold chains for food. We have a fantastic set of speakers from all over the world, who will be sharing their experiences. It's rare to have a panel that has people from the public sector, the private sector, academia, as well as from NGOs and different partnerships. And we have that. I'll just very briefly introduce them to you. As you can see on the slides now, we have Mr. Arijit Sangupta, who is the Director of the Bureau of Energy Efficiency at the Ministry of Power in India. We have Mr. Nemeka Ikevunu, I hope I got that right, co-founder and CEO of Coal Hubs Limited in Nigeria, and winner of Cooling as a Service Prize. We have Mr. Jürgen Kohler, who is the Director of Regulatory Affairs at Carrier Refrigeration, who I'm sure all of you have heard of, as well as the co-chairman of the Global Food Cold Chain Council. We also have Mr. Toby Peters, who's a professor at the University of Birmingham and a leading expert on cold chains. Makina Ieri, who is the manager at CLASP, which is a Washington-based nonprofit focusing on energy efficiency issues. And last but definitely not the least, we have Amanda Brondy, who is the Director of International Projects at the Global Cold Chain Alliance. Now, we have about 40 minutes or so for this discussion. I've got about 3 rounds of questions to the speakers. And if there's time, we would really like to open for questions from the floor. So I'd like to request our speakers to keep their comments to maximum 2 minutes, because I'm sure there must be lots of questions from the audience to hear your insights and your thoughts. Now, for the first round, though, I'm actually going to ask our speakers to just do a very brief introduction, opening remarks, focusing on what their organization or their company are doing to facilitate this transition to net zero cold chains for food. We're going to start with Arijit. Now, you lead the Bureau of Energy Efficiency, which of course is self-explanatory, but it would still be great if you could sort of describe, where the net zero part and the cold chain parts come in.
Thank you, Finn. And of course, at the outset, I'd like to thank the organizers for organizing kind of this webinar series on such an important topic. And also for inviting the Bureau of Energy Efficiency from Government of India and giving us an opportunity to share our thoughts. Now, as far as the concept of net zero cold chain is concerned to the Bureau of Energy Efficiency, of course, it's a new concept. But before that, of course, India, as you are all aware, is one of the second largest producer of fruits and vegetables in the world. And the total horticulture crops was about 300 million tons in the last year. And this sector contributes to almost 17% to the GDP. So that is how important this sector is in as far as the Indian is concerned. Now, if I straight away come to the kind of losses that we normally have. So if we talk about the losses in cases of fruits, it is around 6 to 18%. And in case of vegetables, it is around 7 to 13%. Of course, there are other studies which suggest that it will be higher. But my only point was that food loss waste, it represents a loss of value, avoidable greenhouse gas emission, and a challenge to the food security. And that's why I feel that this net zero food chain concept is very much pertinent, not only to the concept of India, but also to the Bureau of Energy Efficiency scheme of things. Of course, as our name suggests, we are in the country to promote the efficient use of energy and its conservation. And I mean, net zero cold chain, of course, is something I will come back to those points later on as a part of the discussion. But maybe just kind of giving opening remarks. We would like to make them more and more energy efficient by reducing the energy demand, and also at the same time ensure that they use climate friendly refrigerant. This is very much within the scope and mandate of the Bureau of Energy Efficiency. And at the same time, will ensure that there is a larger use of solar and other sources of renewables, so that the energy demand, whatever we have reduced through energy efficiency measures, is met. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Arijit. Nameka, I'd like to hear from you what Coal Hub is doing.
Yeah, thank you very much for that quick one. Coal Hub is maintain 100% solar. Saying that Coal Hubs is a social enterprise that designs, builds, operates, and maintains 100% solar-powered working cold rooms in farm clusters, produce aggregation centers, and outdoor food markets. The hubs are used by smallholder farmers, retailers, and wholesalers to store and preserve fresh fruit and vegetables and extend the shelf life from 2 days to 21 days. And what we are doing is we are demonstrating 100% green cooling with cold hubs because first, all our cold rooms are exclusively solar powered. Actually, in 2019, we were able to save 462,000 kilograms of CO2 because we use solar energy instead of diesel generators. And secondly, all our cold rooms have refrigeration units that uses Aru-290 propane refrigerants, which has low global warming and no ozone depletion potential. This is to minimize the environmental impact of cooling. Thank you.
Great, thank you for trying again. And that's so interesting to hear from you how much you're saving from using solar and renewable energy and things that are much more energy efficient. I'm going to actually now go to Jürgen. Of course, everyone knows about the company you work for, but if you could touch on the cold chain aspect.
Yeah, first of all, good afternoon, good evening, good morning to all the participants of this first This is Cool webinar, jointly organized by the Cool Coalition and Sustainable Energy for All. And I'd like to, first of all, thank the Cool Coalition and Sustainable Energy for All for inviting me to this session as the representative of our cold chain industry. Carrier is a leading provider of global solutions for healthy buildings and healthy, safe, and sustainable cold chains. And Carrier's refrigeration business unit provides sustainable cooling technologies for cold storages, food retailing, food service, and refrigerated transport, supporting the cold chains for perishable food and medicines. If you talk about net zero food cold chains, these are based on continuously improved energy efficiency of the refrigeration technologies and the migration to low, very low, and ultra low GWP refrigerants used in these technologies, as we have heard already from David earlier on. In our cold chain refrigeration technologies, we as Carrier take the lead in a continuing migration from very high and high HFC refrigerants now to low, very low, and ultra low GWP, HFC, HFO blends or natural refrigerants like carbon dioxide, ammonia, and propane. And Carrier offers, in this respect, industrial refrigeration systems that are used in cold storages with ultra-low GWP natural refrigerants, carbon dioxide and ammonia. We provide commercial refrigeration systems for food retail stores and food service applications, also with ultra-low GWP natural refrigerants, carbon dioxide and propane across all climate zones, either as centralized systems, as water loop systems, or as standalone units. And I'd like to emphasize that the integration of supermarket refrigeration systems with waste heat recovery systems as a new trend for the cooling and heating purposes results in a much better energy efficiency of these integrated systems. Carrier develops also a transport refrigeration units with ultra-low GWP natural refrigerant carbon dioxide or pure HFO refrigerant, and also with new low GWP HFC HFO blends in transport refrigeration applications. We also provide innovative electric-driven transport refrigeration units to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions from the engines in transport refrigeration. And overall, we drive continuous improvement of the energy efficiency of our refrigeration systems used along the cold chains. And I'd like to also stress that regional differentiation of the products offered for the cold chains adapt to the needs of our customers regarding the affordability and regional requirements. And finally, we have a global service network that supports our customers around the globe. Thanks so much. Back to Finn.
Thank you, Jürgen. Toby, coming to you next. You have both academic and industrial experience. So tell us what you've been doing, what's been happening.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me here today. So I'm looking at the challenge of how do we meet the rapid growth of cooling and cold chain sustainably and affordably from, in particular, a systems perspective. By way of background, I co-developed liquid air energy storage, so using very cold temperatures as a storage medium. That's now in commercial scale deployment with a 50 megawatt, 250 megawatt hour plant being built here in the UK and larger plants in development worldwide, including in the States. And this is relevant because I think, in my view, one of the main routes to solve the cooling challenge and the cold chain challenges is energy storage, since this is the key to unlocking renewables and how do we store the intermittent or long time energy to use on demand, especially in off-grid or mobile applications. And our go-to position is lithium-ion batteries. But in actual fact, if we think about the service we want, it's cooling. So using ice, liquid air, or other phase change materials as the energy store is potentially far more environmentally friendly and affordable. So with a team of, I think, about now more than 50 researchers and global collaborations, we're looking at the portfolio of cooling needs and how we make, store, move cold. How do we, of course, reduce the demand for cooling? And also, how do we finance cooling, given much of the growth in demand will be in the developing markets? And then we're now also developing, we've just announced the first of them with partners, first of a kind in-market centres of excellence in sustainable cooling and cold chain. The first of these is in Rwanda. It's a Pan-Africa centre to accelerate technology deployment and provide the market understanding, the technology demonstration, think about the value of data, and really important, bring together also the technical and business assistance to help communities and especially farmers deploy cooling so as to, for example, reduce, as we're talking today, food loss, get produce to market quickly and efficiently. So that's what we're doing.
Great, thank you, Toby. I'm going to come back to you on those centres of excellence later, but I'm going to move on to Makina first. Makina, you've obviously done a lot of work on this as well in terms of research and with your work with CLASP. Tell us a bit more.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. So at CLASP, really what we're interested in is the energy and environmental performance of appliances and equipment, and all these towards a more sustainable world, of course. So we care about the two portions, the people and also the planet, and our cooling portfolio really spans across those, clean energy access, but also climate change mitigation. So we've done work, for example, like working with the government, with BEE, for example, in setting and revising efficiency standards for cooled technologies. We've provided actionable data for policy change. We've run competitions that try to unearth innovations in cold storage. We do independent testing of off-grid cooling appliances and even manage incentives that help to develop the market. So we kind of run the whole gamut of what could be considered development of the appliances that are associated with delivering cooling services. And for my part, I look at the research, I look at off-grid appliances in particular, and try to contribute to what is really scarce data in the sector about how to improve their performance and how to make them more affordable, because as we've continued to keep hearing, these are much needed appliances.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to come back to you later on what you think are some of the solutions. But our last speaker, Amanda, tell us about what you've been doing.
Thank you so much, and thanks as well for the invitation. The Global Cold Chain Alliance is at its core a trade association. 100 member companies in 80 countries, and our members, which include both carrier and cold hubs, thank you, include cold storage and transportation companies, as well as design build firms and companies who manufacture the critical components needed to successfully build and operate cold chain facilities. These critical components include innovations to save or reduce energy consumption, which is a huge need for our members. If you don't know much about cold storage, the two primary operating costs are labor and energy, so anything that helps reduce either of these are of great interest. So what role can an association play when looking at net zero cold chains? It's my opinion that the simplest and yet most powerful action that we can take is just to share information. We do this among our members, but we also do this on international development projects. GCCA is where I'll focus my comments. Cold chain is developing rapidly, especially in emerging economies, and given the complexities involved with building and successfully managing integrated cold chains, it's very easy to rely on old information or to choose a path forward that offers the least resistance. This may include facility investments that rely on synthetic refrigerants or may lack any form of energy analysis. Most projects will not have refrigeration engineers on staff, or it's unlikely that they would know about existing options for natural refrigerants. What we attempt to do is to act as a reviewer or advisor. We do not, cannot, and should not force any businesses to make any decisions. They'll form their own decisions based on a number of factors, with probability featuring high. However, the information upon which they base their decisions, whether it's new innovations, old innovations, or just best practices and operations, is known and understood. And then finally, I'd be remiss if I did not mention that GCCA recently launched an Energy Excellence Recognition Program. This uses qualitative and quantitative assessment tools to allow a location to establish a baseline year and then track performance over time to identify challenges and opportunities. Program, I think they have great potential in emerging economies. That's it for me. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Amanda. Now, I'd like to go back to Arijit for a second round of questions. We know that, Indian farmers are increasingly struggling with climate impacts, from unseasonal rains to high temperatures. Now, how do you think, energy efficient cold chains could help build farmers' resilience? And what is your bureau, doing to promote farmers' access to these technologies?
Yeah, thanks again. So as you can understand that recently has announced this ambitious program of doubling the farmers' income in our country, and a well-designed, integrated and energy efficient cold chain can really be the game changer and can enable transformation of the Indian agriculture sector. Now, given the significance of the agriculture in India's economy, energy efficient cold chains is critical for improving the farmers' livelihood, reducing avoidable post-harvest food loss, and ensuring the sustainability of the entire agriculture value chain, right from the farmers to the consumers. Now, coming to the Bureau of Energy Efficiency's role, I would like to inform that the Bureau of Energy Efficiency and the World Bank's Energy and Extractives Global Practice, with support from the Energy Sector Management Assistance Program, that is SMAP, we have collaborated for a study on the assessment of energy efficiency potential and development of regulatory tools for promoting efficiency in the cold chain with a focus on the pack house. Why pack house? Of course, because it is the entry point into the cold chain. And I think in the opening slides of David, we have seen that we are going to, the emissions are going to increase from 4 million tons to 10 million tons in the next 10 years or so. So, and all the pack houses are supposed to be, going to be constructed in the days to come. And the major recommendations of the study are, of course, we would like to prepare some guidelines for good practices as far as operation and maintenance are concerned, and also for better and energy efficient pack house design. Enhance awareness about energy efficiency in the post-harvest management, develop minimum energy efficiency performance standards, and develop a framework and training and certifications. Now, all these recommendations were arrived after a detailed kind of analysis of the present situation in the country, and the team undertook a detailed site visit of some selected pack houses in the country, and then we came at it. So thank you very much.
Thank you. That's really interesting to hear. And of course, it makes sense, right? That when farmers lose less, they will have more income, and that will improve their resilience. Namaka, you just now told us about how you were able to save or avoid these carbon emissions because of the way you do your company using solar and renewables, quite effective and sustainable. Could you also give us examples of how this work, not just in terms of reducing emissions, but has also helped the local food system and the communities?
Thank you very much for that question. In 2019, we had 24 operational code hubs. We are building 13 new code hubs, and we will deploy them before the end of the year, hopefully. Our 24 operational code hubs saved 20,000 tons of food from spoilage. That is the total number of food stored in those cold rooms during that year. But the most important thing is that in saving that food from spoilage, it also saved the resources that went into that food production. Resources such as labor, water, seed, fertilizer. These are resources that goes in producing food which typically spoils. Secondly, the local food system should actually promote safe food. So the 20,400 tons of food that we saved became safe, nutritious food for the healthy consumption of Nigerians. This is food that was not exposed to direct harsh sunlight. Food that had no contamination, food that was packed properly and handled properly. The third thing is that we've been able to increase the household income of 8,517 smallholder farmers, retailers, and wholesalers who are using our services by 50%. Most of them now earn additional $60 to the previous $60 earned simply by eliminating those previous 50% losses. The 50% losses are now new sales for them, which they are actually earning a living from. But most importantly for the community is that we've created 48 new jobs for women by recruiting and training them to work as our hub operators and market attendants in market and farm clusters where we have presence. So all our field operations are driven by these ladies, most of whom have never worked before. So we are actually empowering women by having that cool storage infrastructure in communities. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Namaka. Really inspiring to hear that. Jürgen, David in his presentation touched on a little bit about some of the barriers, but from your extensive experience, what would you say are some of the biggest barriers today to try and achieve this net zero cold chain system?
Yeah, first of all, we heard something about silos along the cold chain, and also maybe silos between different stakeholders that would be driving forces for the implementation of net zero cold chain systems. And here I would like to mention first, maybe there should be a better cooperation of governmental and intergovernmental agencies with the industry to make this migration to net zero cold chain systems feasible. I see, for example, the Montreal Protocol as a big success in the phase out of ozone depleting substances, and the agreed HFC phase down in its Kigali amendment as a good example for such a successful cooperation. The migration to net zero cold chain systems might follow this example on a global, regional, or national scale. Also, regional and national regulations can push the migration to net zero cold chains. And I would consider the first national cooling action plans that we have seen here in several countries as a first building block. Another issue, another barrier, in my point of view, is the awareness of the available net zero cold chain technologies in regards to the importance to have these cold chain technologies applied, the importance of the energy efficiency of the refrigeration technologies used, and the migration to low, very low and ultra low GWP refrigerant solutions in these technologies, and the trend to integrated systems for cooling and heating, and also the increased use of renewable energy sources. A third barrier I would see in the training of service and maintenance technicians in these net zero technologies, because these new net zero cold chain technologies usually operate at higher pressure levels or with flammable refrigerants. And the technicians are normally trained for technologies using non-flammable refrigerants operating at low or medium pressure levels. So there's a need for training for these new technologies using mildly or highly flammable refrigerants and operating at higher pressure levels. And then another barrier might be differences in regional requirements and technology offers. Here, regional and national building codes and product safety standards may pose barriers to the applications of these net zero cold chain technologies. And net zero cold chain technologies are mainly available in developed countries, but not yet available in emerging and developing countries. And then the awareness of the return on investment for investments in that cold chain technology is, in my point of view, also a barrier, because these investments will increase the income of farmers and jobs along the food cold chain. They will reduce the food losses. They will reduce the use of natural resources like land and water, and consequently reduce greenhouse gas emissions from these food cold chains. And finally, these technologies will not only benefit the stakeholders along the food cold chain, but also society and communities in the concerned areas. And financing probably is another barrier that needs to be addressed. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Toby. You just now mentioned, this idea of forming these cold chain centers of excellence around the world, with the first one in Rwanda. How can they help, or do you think they can help with perhaps emergency response as well as recovery from this, coronavirus pandemic and the subsequent economic fallout that we're seeing? And if they can, how can they do that?
Yes, and that's actually very much part of the work we're doing, and we're working with governments on this challenge. We've as a world, we're focusing very much on how do we design a vaccine and how do we manufacture it, but the cold chain requirements for distributing the vaccine have largely been ignored. And universal vaccine access is an existing challenge already in low-income countries, primarily due to the lack of robust cold chains. So we're seeing, we can see often we lose maybe 25% of vaccines between manufacturer and usage. And COVID-19, the pandemic, has really brought to the fore an urgent need for a vaccine cold chain to meet a new set of requirements, mass vaccination in a concentrated period of time. We might need to, vaccinate rapidly up to 5 billion people. We might need to vaccinate them twice, and many of whom live in rural, remote locations. So we need a temperature-controlled process from the manufacturer to a remote village. And at the same time, we need to maintain current immunization services. So we can't solve COVID and see measles or the other diseases, childhood diseases, regrow. So I think, in short, this is probably the single biggest logistics challenge we've ever faced. If you take India, India's got a phenomenal vaccine cold chain program, 50 million children a year vaccinated. But if they want herd immunization, they might need to do 8 to 900 million people in a very short space of time. So I think the vaccination COVID-19 will require a far new fast-track approach to assess, re-engineer, build out the cold chain logistics. And what we can do is generate the evidence about the last mile, the point of use conditions, the gaps, the opportunities. We're developing scenarios for the cold chain, including static and mobile segments, and including how you can use non-vaccine cooling capacity, maybe the food chain, maybe other services to meet this challenge. And then look at the technologies, the finance, the policy, the institutional support for delivering cooling. But also, it's about cooling, not just vaccines. So we need to plan for future emergency or disasters where clean cold chain can be needed. And as said, this should include how we can harness synergistic temperature services, sustainable cooling relative to the country's broader cooling needs. Because yes, we will solve the cold chain for COVID-19, but this technology will then stay there for 10, 15 years. How can we deliver it to have lasting legacy? And through this, we can also, of course, then provide the trialing solutions. We can provide the training and the capacity building. So I think these centres, I hope, will very much be part of solving the challenge, but also the lasting legacy of clean cooling.
Thanks, Toby. That's fascinating. And just moving on to McKenna, following on from what Jürgen and Toby talked about, right, with having access to these technologies in the last mile, getting to those people, farmers, farming communities in remote places where, of course, access to cold chain, both for health as well as food reasons, could revolutionize them. But then they need access to energy, and many of them are far away from the grid, and it might not be a few years until they get connected. Now, in those cases, do you see off-grid as the solution? How can this help?
Yeah, and I just want to quickly circle back on what Toby has said and many others have said. It's about a rural ecosystem, not just those farming communities, but that being a linchpin for rural development is something that an effective cold chain can do and help these communities also be resilient, not just to what's happening right now, but for the future, right? In terms of climate change, but also other economic crises. But absolutely, off-grid energy has a potential to be a viable solution. So talking about how we went about trying to discover some of the innovations that are happening in off-grid energy associated with powering cold chain solutions. So we ran an off-grid cold chain challenge, and we got a glimpse at the potential of some of these innovations, especially for that first mile or last mile, depending on how you look at it, for cold storage at that point that is closest to the end user or to the producer, the agricultural producer. And we saw really creative business model solutions as well. For example, you mentioned cooling as a service, which we saw with Cold Hubs, which was one of our finalists. And we also saw really interesting innovations in the technology itself. Now, obviously, cold storage is just a first link, and there are so many other links in the cold chain that need to be innovated around. But the thing with the off-grid solutions, they're still really early. They're prone to technical challenges. And for example, of the 10 companies that we incentivized to deploy a solution on the ground, only 4 were really able to do that. And even these 4, there was we still face some technical challenges. And so it just goes to show that though the technologies are coming, we still have a lot to do to kind of make them appropriate, to make them effective in the regions that we want to deploy them, and to also make them reliable. A lot of these solutions were placed in areas where there was grid access, but because of the intermittent grid, the unreliability, the people who are working on this cold chain or who are accessing this cold chain needed an alternative. So not only can off-grid be, a solution by itself, but it could also shore up a grid that is not reliable or that is intermittent. And basically, I guess to conclude is that though they can be effective, these solutions, we're still kind of looking forward to more technology improvements, reduction in cost. They are very expensive. New business models, innovations around that to make them really accessible to these farmers and these farming communities that we are talking about.
Great, thank you, McKenna, and sorry about the tech stuff. Amanda, you talked a little bit just now about working your work and what the Global Coaching Alliance does, which is an organization that's obviously working on on strengthening and building temperature control supply chains around the world. Now, tell us about what's the current status of the global cold chains and where are the biggest gaps and how can they be addressed?
Thank you. So the existing global cold chains, I think, proved their resiliency in the crisis, but it also exposed some weaknesses. Of course, namely, the cold chain doesn't exist everywhere. So if asked to characterize it in one phrase, I would just say lack of capacity. And I mean this in terms of assets, the actual space available for refrigerated storage or transport, as well as human capacity. Cold chain is a solution and one that I believe in, but it is complicated and requires new roadmap for how to develop cold chain in their country, and thought that we could just provide a list with the name of the country kind of inserted generally at the top. And I really wish it were this simple, but it requires consideration of so many factors. As an example, if you consider the number of products that require temperature control, dairy, horticulture, meat, aquaculture, and then you think about all the different temperatures required for these products and whether you're working with fresh or frozen. And if it's fresh products, there are different temperature zones for different products and some that are just not compatible and should not be stored together. And then outside of the commodities, you're thinking about storage, you also have to look at post-harvest, transport, and retail. And so thinking through all that, you can kind of imagine how many different groups of people need to be educated on cold chain best practices and how it truly is a chain and not just simply storage. And then if you're making an investment, it's not just the product types, but you need to know the volumes, current and projected, what the market's demanding, and if the target products are horticulture products, seasonality should be factored in. It is really complicated, but it is possible. I am an optimist, or I would have talked myself out of this job a long time ago. And it's my belief that addressing cold chain gaps will require coordinated efforts between governments, donors, and the private sector, especially for clean cold chains. And I know that Jürgen touched upon this, and I think we are in complete alignment. There is a role that each group can play to support one another. Governments can provide an enabling environment looking at policies in place that may hinder development or ways in which they can support the private sector. This is not to say that they shouldn't provide enforcement, but civil servants can be educated about the impact of their policies on private sector actors. Donors, I believe, are very well placed to provide support through training and convening, providing that platform for information sharing. In addition, there are a lot of donors out there that are providing funding for feasibility studies, which are critical and will help the private sector to make decisions based on current and relevant information. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. We've actually got a few questions coming in, but we still have one round of questions to come through. So the speakers have talked about how, in order to get to net zero, what we need are energy efficiency, in terms of appliances and systems. Tell us a bit about perhaps some of the policies and standards in terms of decarbonizing cold chain in India that you're developing, and if there are any other measures that your bureau is planning to come up as well to make sure that high quality, efficient cold chains is available to all parts of India.
Yeah, thank you, Thin. Again, so as we have seen in the opening slides given by David, I will again refer because there were mention of India, and we have seen that although the cold storage is there in place, but if we talk about the entire cold chain, the other components of the cold chain, be it pack houses, be it ripening chambers, be it reefer vehicles, that thing somewhere is missing. And we are, of course, India is one of the the first countries in the world to develop a comprehensive cooling action plan. And it has a long-term vision to address the cooling requirement across sectors. And of course, it also lists out the actions which can eventually help to reduce the cooling demand. So, I mean, with this background, of course, this is a very effective policy framework that the government of India has come up with. And I have referred to the study in my earlier comment, which we are doing in association with the World Bank. And one of the recommendations focuses on development of standards and labeling. And in fact, we, the Bureau of Energy Efficiency, we are in the process of preparing a roadmap to implement the kind of recommendations that we have got from the report. Of course, effective policies focusing on energy efficiency can drastically reduce the energy demand of various cold chain equipments. And if we can prepare standards and levels, which we are in the process of doing, and we are trying to mainstream the kind of the cold chain activities within our main goal. So we will be able to kind of ensure that high quality and efficient cold chain equipments are available in India. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Arijit. There was a question that was coming in through to you as well, asking about those. So thanks for answering that. Now, Namika, you are using this whole, cooling as a service business model. Tell us a bit more about how or whether this model is different from or better than others. And, how could we elevate this model, the success that you're seeing, from your company, a single company in a single community, into something that's wider and bigger, going to the national level, regional, and even perhaps global levels?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. I think cooling as a service business model is different and better than others because it makes it possible to have access to cooling for all. Cooling as a service kind of liberalizes or democratizes cooling, making it accessible for those who might find it difficult to actually acquire cooling technologies, which is available. Because for us at Cold Hubs, farmers and retailers and wholesalers of fresh fruit and vegetables do not need to struggle with acquisition and maintenance of solar-powered cold storage. What Cold Hub does is to deploy it, maintain it, and operate it on their behalf, and they pay as they store. And just for a small amount of money, the equivalent of 28 US cents, you can actually store 20-kilogram plastic crate of any type of food inside the cold room for 1 day. So what we do basically is to take off the stress of managing the fresh fruit and vegetables stock, just enabling them focus on their core mandates. In terms to elevating it, I think a lot of people still don't understand how it works. And so in elevating, I suggest 2 steps. One is knowledge sharing. We need to share insights and lessons learned, hear from success stories. There's been a lot of activities, just a little bit of activities across the world. So I actually invite participants of this webinar to participate in the Cooling as a Service e-Summit coming up in December. It's being organized by the Basel Agency for Sustainable Energy Base, And then secondly is funding. We need a lot of philanthropic capital to unlock some of these business models, test it rigorously, prove it beyond every reasonable doubt before we start talking about taking a private investment to go to scale globally. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Namaka. Jürgen, moving from Nigeria to Europe, how expensive is it going to be to develop such a system? And, does the private sector need support to develop and deploy it? You talked about financing as one of the big barriers just now. If you could very briefly, we're running out of time, so if you could very briefly answer that. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I mean, the investment in new product programs like net zero cold chain technologies accrue quickly to several $1 million per product program due to a very extensive engineering work for the development of these products and intensive testing that needs to be done, and also for the reception of the respective certifications that are required for some of these products. In regards to the financial support, if you look at small enterprises that should develop such technologies, financial support might be appropriate. In general, I would say to promote these technologies, regulatory support would benefit all the equipment manufacturers across the board. But what I mentioned earlier on financial support probably will also be needed to migrate to these net zero cold chain technologies in emerging and developing countries.
Thanks, Jürgen. Toby, as a technical expert, what do you think is the bigger barrier? The technology, maybe the expense, having the latest technology that can do what we wanted to do, or the implementation of that technology itself?
Okay, I'm going to try and keep this really quick, but I might answer a slightly different way. I think the biggest challenge for solving the cooling demand is our fixation with electricity and batteries. Cooling will be the biggest driver, is one of the biggest drivers in energy demand over the next 30 years. And we could far better manage this in a system approach, reducing demand, harnessing waste heat, waste cold, thermal energy storage, both in vehicles and buildings, rather than simply greening electricity or incremental efficiency gains in electrically powered technologies. This is resulting in lack of prioritizing of cooling in the energy and the climate debates and strategies, and lack of investment in technologies. And in turn, therefore, we're not getting the volume to drive costs down. So we have to start thinking thermally and change the question. What is the service I require, and how can we deliver it in the most efficient, affordable, and environmentally friendly way?
Great, thanks, Toby. Our last two speakers, McKenna, you talked just now about the importance of off-grid solutions to reach that last mile. What can be done to ensure that they're available at scale, not just in one community or one region, but everywhere?
So we would identify and promote emerging technologies. And then once we've identified these innovators, we need to put R&D dollars behind these innovators to make them fit for purpose, to localize them, to make them robust and affordable. And then we need to prove business cases, as Nemeka quite rightly said. We need to attract big players into the spaces, into off-grid spaces, using incentives, but also with data and showing effective demonstration projects so that these big players can, find the role to play in delivering cooling services across regions that are unusual suspects for the cold chain.
Thanks so much, McKenna. Amanda, access to full, cold chains for food is obviously, as we know, as today's topic talk about, is crucial to decrease poverty and reduce hunger and increase resilience, right? And David talked about it, and I want you to touch on it a bit more, talked about the fact that maybe it is possible to leapfrog from not having any cold chain, from zero access to going net zero. Can you very briefly explain how that can be done?
Well, I can say, is it possible? Yes, there are amazing innovations that exist and are currently being developed. Many of these by GCCM members like Cold Hubs and Carrier. We have an amazing capacity to meet challenges, but it will not be easy, and the private sector can't do this alone. Substantial government, donor support, and collaboration to help do this, especially in the time frame that meets the urgent needs that we're facing today. That's all I can do in about 30 seconds.
Thank you so much. We actually have a few questions that were coming in, but unfortunately we don't have time. So I do apologize for not being able to take it. There are quite a few that's coming in, Toby, for you, asking about the Centers of Excellence and how to reduce cooling. What we'll try and do is to try and either link to the Centers of Excellence and include some of the links and information in the post-event email that the UNEP will be sending. Before I pass over to our last speaker, I just want to take very briefly and then the key takeaways. I think we all know the challenge, the need, more than 1 billion people lacking access to proper cooling, and the fact that it is responsible for about 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions, the use of cooling. And just in terms of looking at food loss and waste because of lack of access to cold chains, there are a lot of, I think, challenges we understand, in terms of technology being expensive, not having enough financing, but there are already solutions that are available, and people like Cold Hubs who are already showing that you can not only reduce emissions, but actually improve income, communities, increase incomes, provide employment to marginalized groups like women. So it is possible. The question is, how can we scale it? Who can help? And perhaps, like Toby said, maybe we also need to think on it on a completely different perspective and not just look at incremental improvements, but to look at it in terms of what other services need and how best to deliver it effectively and sustainably. Now I'm going to invite our last speaker, Dan Hamza Goodacre, who is the non-executive director of the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program and cooling sector lead for the COP26 Champions team, who will be giving us the closing remarks. Dan?
Thank you, Finn. Can you hear me?
Yes,
great.
we can.
Okay, I think I have minus whatever, 1 minute or minus 3 minutes, so I'm going to do this super quickly. Thank you, everybody, moderator, hosts, organisers, audience, speakers. Tick, that bit. Okay, I had 5 comments. I've reduced them to 2, right? So here they are. The first is, I mean, there's so many amazing ideas, like listening to everybody. Okay, you've got great solutions. You've identified the barriers. different angles, how to link up financing, etc. I'm just thinking about how to link supply and demand, and some of the biggest demand I see right now is coming through the commitment to net zero, which is what this conversation is about. It's a subset of the overall challenge of getting to net zero. And there are now over 2,000 non-party stakeholders who have made commitments to net zero. They include investors and businesses representing nearly half of global GDP. I think there are about 80 countries, 80 countries, I think, that have made net zero commitments. So many of them don't really know how to get to net zero, and many of them have also overlooked the role of cooling in the commitments that they've made. So I just would encourage all of you to go and have a look on the Race to Zero website, and which lists all of the organisations, businesses, investors, etc., that have made that commitment. Look and see who they are. Look and see how your solutions might fit within what they need, whether it's on a commercial angle, whether it's an industrial angle, whether it's public sector, etc. So let's try and match up some of the supply and demand. And then the second comment is that as part of the COP26 High-Level Champions campaign, and with the various of the Cool Coalition members, we're developing a pathway to net zero cooling. And this will be launched in the coming weeks through the COP26 dialogues and then through to the Climate Summit on December the 12th. Of course, we have factored in the importance of cold chains, whether that's the mobile element, whether that's the stationary refrigeration. We know we can do better. So this is a sort of a hands up to say, please join with us when we put that out for consultation, which it will be in the first instance. We'd love to get your feedback. So look out for an email, probably coming from Sophie and the team in the UNE Cool Coalition Secretariat, inviting you hopefully to join the webinar when we launch the pathway, and then to give us some feedback so we can enhance that and then finalise it by the end of the year. So thank you all for a great discussion. Let's carry on this really important work.
Great, thank you so much, Dan. Thank you to all our speakers and all the panelists. I wish we have more time to take questions and ask you more questions, but hopefully the conversation can continue even after this event. Thank you very much for joining us.